Alma Reed rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a Tuesday in the summer of 1879 with a rifle across her saddle, a bruise yellowing along her jaw, and a rage so cold and precise it could have cut glass. She had not eaten in 2 days. She had not slept properly in 4. The horse beneath her, a half-lame roan she had traded for at a way station outside of Wichita, moved with a reluctant, choppy gait that matched the rhythm of her fury. The sun was merciless overhead, a white hammer beating down on the flat Kansas earth, and the town of Caldwell shimmered at its edges like something not quite real. But it was real. She had made certain of that before she came. She had asked 3 different men at 3 different crossroads, and all 3 had told her the same thing. Caldwell. That was where Ellis Donahue had gone. That was where he had taken everything that belonged to her. She was 24 years old, and she had been called an outlaw by men who had done far worse than she ever had. The label had come after the incident in Abilene, when she had shot the lock off a county jail to free her younger brother, who had been wrongly imprisoned on charges that everyone in 3 counties knew were fabricated by the local land baron. She had not hurt anyone. She had fired twice, broken iron, and ridden hard. But her name had gone into the newspaper, and the newspaper had called her dangerous, and dangerous had become outlaw the way water became mud when you added enough dirt to it. She did not argue the point. Outlaw was a word that kept people at a respectful distance, and distance had served her fine for most of her life. What had not served her fine was trusting Ellis Donahue. He had come through the small plot of land she had worked with her brother outside of Wellington 6 months ago, charming and well-dressed, and full of promises. He had spoken about a cattle partnership, about expansion, about the kind of future that 2 smart people could build together if they combined their resources. Her brother Tommy had been skeptical. Alma had been foolishly hopeful. She had signed papers she should have read more carefully. She had believed words she should have weighed more honestly. And then Tommy had died of a fever in February, sudden and terrible, and Ellis Donahue had used the confusion of her grief and the small print of those papers to claim the deed to the land, the cattle, and every dollar she had put into the operation. By the time she understood what had happened, he was already gone. Taken it all, left her with a horse, a rifle, and the clothes she wore. The grudge she carried was not hot. It was not the loud, sloppy anger of someone who had lost their temper. It was a cold, architectural thing, built carefully over the 6 weeks she had spent tracking Ellis Donahue across Kansas, working odd jobs, sleeping under stars, asking careful questions of careful people. She did not intend to shoot him. She intended to find the papers he had forged, retrieve what was rightfully hers, and if the law would not help her, she would find another way. She always found another way. She rode to the end of the main street and stopped in front of the general store, tying the roan to the post with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion she would not let herself acknowledge. A man sitting on a barrel outside the store watched her with the kind of look that had once made her uncomfortable and now made her nothing at all. "Where does a person find the sheriff in this town?" she asked. The man on the barrel shifted his tobacco to the other cheek. "Sheriff Harlan's office is on the far end past the livery, but he ain't much good to strangers." "He does not have to be good to me," she said. "He just has to listen." She led the roan toward the livery first because the animal needed water more than she needed anything, and she had always taken care of her horses before herself. That was something her father had taught her. Her father had taught her a great many things before he died, most of them useful, all of them hard. The livery was a broad, low structure that smelled of hay and manure and the specific warm darkness of animals housed together. A boy of perhaps 15 was forking hay near the entrance, and he looked up at her arrival with wide, uncomplicated eyes. "I need water for this horse and a stall for the afternoon," she said. "Yes, ma'am. That'll be 15 cents. She paid him from the thin fold of coins she kept in her breast pocket and began unsaddling the roan herself, because she did not trust anyone else to do it right. She was working the cinch loose when she heard a voice behind her, a man's voice, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had no reason to raise it because things generally went the way he intended. That animal's favoring her left foreleg. She did not turn around immediately. She finished the cinch first, then slid the saddle free and set it over the stall rail before she looked over her shoulder. The man standing at the edge of the livery entrance was tall, broad-shouldered without being heavy, with dark hair that had gone a little long at the collar, and a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something that was not exactly handsome, but was completely, immediately honest. He wore a plain canvas shirt and work trousers tucked into boots, no jacket despite the heat, and a hat that had been good once and was still serviceable. He was not wearing a gun belt, which was unusual enough in Caldwell in 1879 to make her notice it. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two more, not much older than her. He was looking at the roan with professional attention, and she realized he had not been speaking to her particularly. He had simply said a thing that was true. "I know," she said. "She picked up something in her shoe 2 days ago. I worked it out, but she is still tender. May I?" He nodded at the horse, asking permission in a way that she found unexpectedly courteous. "Go ahead." He moved to the roan without any drama, running a hand along her neck first to introduce himself to the animal before crouching to lift the left foreleg. He examined the hoof with a focused, practiced expression, pressing gently around the frog and the sole. The roan, who had shied from the livery boy, stood perfectly still for him. "There's still some bruising in here," he said. "She needs a few days of rest and some packing on this foot. She'll be fine, but she should not be ridden hard." "I do not plan to ride her hard," Alma said. "I plan to be in town for a day or two." He set the hoof down and stood, brushing his hands against his thighs. He looked at her then, properly looked at her, and she saw him take in the state of her. The road dust, the bruised jaw, the rifle she had balanced against the stall rail, the particular quality of her stillness that people who paid attention usually recognized as exhaustion held together by willpower. He did not comment on any of it. He simply said, "Nathan Sheridan. I run the Sheridan Ranch about 4 miles east of town." "Alma Reed," she said, and she watched to see if the name meant anything to him. It did not appear to, or if it did, he hid it so well that it amounted to the same thing. "You have business in Caldwell, Miss Reed." "I do. The hotel on 2nd Street is decent enough. Clara Minton runs it. She is fair." He paused. "If you find yourself needing anything, the feed store is mine. Front Street on the north side. My foreman, Cal, is there most days." She did not know what to do with the offer, stated so plainly, without any expectation visible in it. Men in her experience either wanted something from her or were afraid of her. This man seemed to be neither. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it, though the words felt unfamiliar in her mouth after weeks of traveling alone. He nodded once and walked out of the livery the way he had walked in, without particular hurry, and she watched him go with a feeling she did not immediately name. She found Sheriff Harlan's office at the far end of the main street, as the man on the barrel had told her, and she found Sheriff Harlan himself behind his desk, a heavy-set man of 50 or so who looked at her the way she had expected him to look at her, with the immediate, reflexive skepticism of someone who had been told a name in a newspaper story and had decided that names in newspaper stories were what they were. "Alma Reed," he said flatly. "I know who you are." "Then you know why I am here," she said, and sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited to. He was quiet for a moment, studying her. "You are looking for Ellis Donahue." "I am looking for papers that Ellis Donahue stole from me, papers that prove ownership of land and cattle that he fraudulently claimed for himself after my brother died. Donahue's a businessman in this town. He's got friends on the county board." "I am sure he does," Alma said. "Men who steal things are generally very good at making friends with people who can protect them. That is how they continue to steal." Harlan's expression tightened slightly. "Now, miss, I am not asking you to take my word for it," she said. "I am asking you to look at the original land deed, which was filed in the Wellington County office, and which has my name on it and my brother's name on it, and compare it against whatever paper Ellis Donahue has presented here. I am asking you to do your job." There was a silence between them that was long enough to be meaningful. "I'll look into it," he said finally, and she could tell from the way he said it that he might not, or might not do it quickly, or might do it in a way that conveniently came to nothing. "I appreciate that," she said and stood. "I will be at the Minton Hotel. I plan to stay until this is resolved." She left the office and stood for a moment in the street, feeling the futility of the conversation settle over her. She had expected exactly this and still found it exhausting. The law in these places was not blind. It was myopic, selectively seeing what the most powerful men in the vicinity wanted it to see. Ellis Donahue had money now, her money, and money in a small Kansas town in 1879 was as good as a wall between a man and any consequence. She would have to find another way. She always had to find another way. The Minton Hotel was clean and modest, and Clara Minton was a woman of perhaps 55 with sharp, kind eyes who asked Alma no questions about the bruise on her jaw, provided her with a room at the end of the upper hall, and told her that supper was served at 6 and that hot water for washing could be arranged for a dime. Alma paid for the room and the hot water, and when the water came, she sat in the small tub and let herself be still for the first time in weeks. She thought about Tommy. She thought about the sound of his laugh, which had been too big for his slight frame, filling up whatever room he was in. She thought about the look on his face in the last days, when the fever had taken the brightness out of his eyes and left something frightened and small behind. She had not cried since he died. The grief was there. She could feel its weight constantly, but it had no channel out of her. It sat in her chest like a stone, and the anger she built around it was what kept her moving. She dressed in the clean clothes she had carried in her saddlebag, ate the supper Clara Minton served with no real appetite, and went to bed early. She did not sleep well. In the morning she went to find Ellis Donahue herself, because waiting on Sheriff Harlan felt like watching a horse die of thirst while you stood next to a well. She had learned his habits from careful inquiry. He took breakfast at the Plainsman Saloon, which served meals in the front room before it became a drinking establishment after noon. She walked in at 8 in the morning and found him at a corner table, reading a newspaper over a plate of eggs, looking precisely as comfortable and prosperous as she had feared he would look. He was 43 or 44, broad-faced and ruddy, with the particular self-satisfaction of a man who had learned early that he could take what he wanted and had been refining the skill ever since. He saw her, and for just a moment something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt, not quite fear, a calculation. "Alma Reed," he said, setting down the newspaper with the deliberate calm of a man who wanted her to know he was not afraid of her. "Ellis," she said. She sat down across from him without invitation, just as she had done with the sheriff. "I want the deed. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. The Wellington land, the cattle, the account at the First Territorial Bank of Wellington that had my name and my brother's name on it. All of it is mine. You know it. I know it. The county records in Wellington know it. I want you to sign it back over to me, and then I will leave you alone." He picked up his coffee cup. "You've got nothing," he said. "The papers are legal. Your brother signed over his interest before he died, and the partnership agreement transferred the remaining interest on his death. Tommy would not have signed anything over to you." "Men do surprising things when they're dying," Donahue said, and the casual ease with which he said it made her hands go still on the table. "I want those papers," she said quietly. "The originals. You can want all you like." He looked at her steadily. "You're an outlaw, Miss Reed. You got no standing to make claims in a Kansas court. If you come at me legally, they'll laugh you out of the courthouse. If you come at me any other way, I'll have the sheriff on you inside of an hour." She held his gaze for a long moment, then she stood. "We'll see about that," she said. She walked out into the bright morning, feeling the cold architecture of her grudge settle and realign around the new information. The forged signature on the papers. The claim that Tommy had signed something voluntarily. She needed a lawyer, or she needed a witness, or she needed the original Wellington records, all of which would require either money she did not have or connections she did not have in this town. She was standing on the boardwalk outside the saloon, turning options over in her mind, when she became aware that she was being watched. She looked up the street and saw Nathan Sheridan coming out of the feed store he had mentioned, talking with a lean, weathered man she supposed was his foreman. He caught her eye across the distance of the street and after a moment said something to the other man and crossed toward her. She waited because there was no reason not to. "Morning," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "How is the roan?" "I checked on her before breakfast, moving a little easier." He nodded. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her the day before, with that disconcerting, honest attention. "You look like your morning didn't go the way you hoped." She almost laughed. That is a polite way to put it. He was quiet for a moment and she expected him to do what most people did, which was fill the silence with something trivial. Instead he said, "Is it Donahue?" She looked at him sharply. "I saw you go into the Plainsman," he said. "Donahue's been a point of conversation in this town since he arrived 8 months ago, not all of it flattering." He paused. "I don't mean to pry, it's your business." "He stole my land," she said, because something about the directness of him made lying or deflecting feel like too much work. "He used forged documents to claim my land and my cattle after my brother died. I came here to get it back." Nathan Sheridan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have anywhere to be this morning?" "Not particularly." "Then come out to the ranch. I want to show you something." She looked at him for a moment, measuring the offer against everything she knew about how the world worked, which generally told her that something that sounded like help usually came with a price. But he met her gaze without flinching, and there was nothing in his eyes that she could read as calculation or agenda. "All right," she said. He had a buckboard, which he offered to drive, and she tied the roan to the back and sat beside him on the bench, and they drove the 4 miles east out of town in the early morning light while the Kansas grass stretched golden and enormous in every direction. He told her about the ranch as they drove, not boastfully, but practically, the way a person describes something they know well and have earned. He had inherited it from his father 10 years ago, when he was 20, a struggling operation that had been 3 sections of difficult land and a small herd. He had spent the decade building it into something that actually worked. "My father was a good man," he said. "But he was not a good businessman. He trusted too many people who did not deserve it." "Mine was the same," she said. "He taught me most of what I know about land and cattle. He just did not teach me enough about people." Nathan glanced at her sideways. "How long ago did he pass?" 8 years. I was 16. Tommy was 12. She paused. "We managed." "I expect you did," he said, and it was not condescending. It was just a statement of fact about someone he was still determining. The ranch was impressive in the honest, working sense of the word. Not grand, nothing that put itself above what it was, but solid and well kept and clearly tended by people who understood that the land required constant, attentive work. The main house was a 2-story affair of wood and stone, surrounded by practical outbuildings, corrals, and a bunkhouse from which 2 cowhands emerged as they arrived, going about the morning's work. He led her to the office off the main room, a spare, organized space with a large desk and filing drawers along one wall, and he pulled from one of those drawers a document she had not expected to see. A copy of the Wellington County Land Registry from the previous year, the kind that the county surveyor periodically distributed to neighboring landowners who had interests in adjacent properties. "I bought cattle from a man in Wellington last spring," he said, "and during the process the county registry came across my desk. I hold onto these things." He set it on the desk in front of her. "Is that your land?" She looked at the registry. There it was, her name, Thomas Reed, the parcel number, the acreage, the recorded date of purchase which predated anything Ellis Donahue could claim. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out slightly unsteady despite herself. "This is a county record," Nathan said. "It's not the original deed, but it corroborates that the land was registered in your name. A lawyer could use this." She looked up at him. "Why are you doing this?" He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated more than a quick, easy answer would have been. Because Donahue tried to buy a water right from me 6 months ago, and something about the deal felt dishonest. I didn't conclude the sale. And because what you just told me about him using forged papers after your brother died makes me angry in a way I don't generally enjoy. She held his gaze. I do not have money for a lawyer. There's a man in Caldwell named Peter Waverly. He is honest and he owes me a favor. If you'll let me send him to you, I will do that. She was quiet for a moment because the offer was large and because accepting large things from people she did not know had historically cost her. But the document in front of her and the straightforward way he had led her to it suggested something other than manipulation. "All right," she said again, and she noticed that it was becoming her answer to him with a frequency that should perhaps have concerned her more than it did. He offered her coffee, which she accepted, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table while his housekeeper, a stout, friendly woman named Margaret who had been with the ranch for years, moved around them producing cups and a plate of bread without any visible curiosity about who Alma was. "Tell me about the land," he said. "What's on it?" So she told him. She told him about the 240 acres outside Wellington that she and Tommy had worked for 3 years, building up a herd from nothing, fencing and watering, and improving the soil, putting every dollar they earned back into the place. She told him about the cattle, 68 head of decent shorthorn stock, they had assembled with genuine effort and real sacrifice. She told him about Tommy's plans for a windmill to improve the water access, a plan they had nearly saved enough to execute when he got sick. Nathan listened the way very few people listened, without interrupting, without offering opinions she had not asked for, without looking anywhere but at her. It was a specific quality of attention that she had rarely experienced, and it disarmed her in ways she could feel but not entirely explain. "It sounds like a good operation," he said when she finished. "It was," she said. "It is. I just need to get it back." "We'll get it back," he said, and she heard the pronoun and felt something shift very slightly in her chest, near where the stone of grief lived. Peter Waverly was a compact, quick-minded man of 42, who wore his legal knowledge the way some men wore expensive hats, with a casual confidence that made others feel less than they were. He was not unkind, just efficient, and when Nathan brought him to the Minton Hotel that same afternoon to meet Alma, he looked at the county registry copy and at the notes she had written documenting her case with the focused eyes of a man sorting through something interesting. "This is workable," he said after an hour of questions that she answered steadily and precisely. Donahue would have to produce the original papers Tommy allegedly signed, and if those papers are forged, any competent examination will show it. The problem is getting him to produce them, which requires a court order, which requires a judge willing to issue one despite Donahue's connections here. "There is a circuit judge due in Caldwell in 3 weeks, Nathan said. He had sat quietly through most of Waverly's assessment, but he had clearly been thinking about the logistics. "Judge Ellison, he's honest. I know that because he once ruled against my own interests in a water dispute and I found myself respecting him for it afterward." Waverly nodded slowly. "If we can get the case before Ellison with the registry as foundation evidence, yes. I think we can make the argument." He looked at Alma. "I'll take the case. I told you my situation," she said. "I cannot pay you now. I can pay you after when." "Nathan's already spoken to me about terms," Waverly said, with a sideways glance at Nathan that made her look at Nathan too. "I told Peter I would cover his fees against the outcome," Nathan said simply, without looking away from her steady gaze. "This is not charity, Miss Reed. If you get the land back, you pay me back when you're able. If you don't, which I don't expect, then we'll have tried the honest thing." She felt something she did not want to feel, something warm and inconvenient and ill-timed. She pushed it back behind the professional demands of the moment. "That is an extraordinary offer from someone I met yesterday," she said. "It is," he agreed. but I'm generally pretty good at reading people, and I think I'm reading you correctly." She wanted to ask what he was reading. She did not ask. Instead, she said, "Then I accept. Thank you, Nathan." It was the first time she had used his first name, and she heard him hear it, a slight pause, and then he nodded and looked at Waverly to continue the conversation. The 3 weeks before the circuit judge arrived were not idle ones. Alma stayed at the Minton Hotel and paid her way each day by helping Clara Minton with the laundry and the bookkeeping, which she was good at. She spent mornings working through documents with Peter Waverly, afternoons visiting the livery to tend the roan, who was improving steadily, and evenings in the quieter part of the hotel lobby, writing out detailed accounts of every transaction she and Tommy had undertaken with Ellis Donahue, every conversation she could recall, every document she had seen. Nathan came to town every 2 or 3 days for feed store business or ranch supply, and each time he came, he made a point of stopping by wherever she happened to be. It was not intrusive. He did not demand her time or her company. He would simply appear, ask how the preparations were going, offer any practical assistance he could think of, and leave when she indicated she was busy. She began to look forward to it in a way that surprised her. On the 4th day of his visits, she was sitting on the hotel porch in the late afternoon when he arrived, and instead of discussing the case, he sat down in the chair beside her, and they talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with Ellis Donahue. He told her about the ranch in its early days, when he had been 20 years old and alone and terrified, with dead grass and a failing well, and no idea how to ask for help from anyone. She told him about the first winter she and Tommy had spent alone on the Wellington land, when Tommy had been 16 and she 20, and the roof of the small house they'd built had partially collapsed under heavy snow, and they had lived for 6 weeks in a space the size of a large closet while they repaired it. And somehow that had been one of the best periods of her life, because Tommy had been hilarious about it, turning every disaster into a story they would tell forever. She heard herself laughing about it and realized she had not laughed, genuinely laughed, in the entire 6 months since Tommy had died. She looked at Nathan and found him smiling at her, and the smile was the most completely unguarded thing she had seen on an adult face in a very long time. "You miss him," Nathan said. "Every day," she said, and the stone in her chest shifted slightly, not gone, but changed in some way she could not name. "I lost my mother when I was 18, he said. "There's no end to it, you just build around it." "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what it is like." They sat for a while after that without talking, watching the main street of Caldwell move through its late afternoon business, and the silence was the comfortable kind, which was rarer than people generally admitted. Ellis Donahue became aware of her preparations. She had expected this. Waverly had warned her that Donahue would not simply wait to see what happened, that he would move to shore up his position. And indeed, midway through the 2nd week, Sheriff Harlan came to find her at the hotel with an expression that mixed official sternness with personal discomfort. "Donahue is claiming you threatened him," Harlan said. "Says you came into the Plainsman and made physical threats." "I sat across a table from him and asked him to return stolen property," Alma said calmly. "There were at least 4 witnesses. I am happy for you to speak with them." Harlan shifted his weight. "I'm not saying I believe him. But you came here to tell me anyway," she said. "I understand. You're in a difficult position, Sheriff. You have a man with money and connections on one side and a woman with a newspaper name and a county registry on the other. I am asking you to do the honest thing when the time comes. That is all." Harlan looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I never am," she said pleasantly. Nathan heard about the sheriff's visit that afternoon from his foreman, who had heard it from the man on the barrel outside the general store, who seemed to hear everything in Caldwell as a matter of personal vocation. Nathan came to find her before supper, not agitated, but carrying a kind of careful attention that she had begun to recognize as his version of concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly fine," she said. "I expected Donahue to try something like this. It's what cornered men do." "He's not cornered yet," Nathan said. "He will be," she said, and she said it with a certainty that came from the cold architectural knowledge that she had evidence. She had a competent lawyer, and she had the truth. He looked at her for a moment with that honest, direct attention. "Would you like to come to the ranch this Saturday?" he said. "Margaret makes a supper that would make you forget every bad thing that's happened to you for at least an hour." She felt that inconvenient warmth again. "Is this a professional invitation?" "It is not," he said without any embarrassment. "It's a personal one." She held his gaze, he held hers. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." The ride out to the Sheridan Ranch on Saturday was different from the first one. Easier and quieter in the way that things become easier and quieter when they are not entirely new. Nathan drove the buckboard again, and she sat beside him. And this time the conversation ranged widely and naturally over subjects that had nothing to do with the legal situation she was in. He asked her about where she had grown up, and she told him. A small town in Missouri that no one outside of Missouri had ever heard of, her father's small farm, the way the land had looked in the summers of her childhood, which had been generous and beautiful. He told her he had grown up in this part of Kansas, that he had left once at 17, intending to see more of the country, and had gotten as far as Oklahoma before the pull of the land he knew had become stronger than the pull of the unknown, and he had come back. "Do you regret not going further?" she asked. "Not anymore," he said, and he said it easily, without drama, but she felt the present tense of it. Supper at the ranch was everything he had promised. Margaret produced a roast with vegetables and bread, and a dried apple pie that was the best thing Alma had eaten since before Tommy died. The two cowhands, a young man named Danny who talked too much and said nothing unkind, and an older hand called Pete who said almost nothing, and had the eyes of someone who had seen a great deal, joined them at the table in the easy, democratic way of working ranches. After supper, Nathan showed her the new section of fencing his hands had been building along the south pasture, and they walked it in the long summer evening light, the grass gold and the air cooling, and he told her his plans for the ranch over the next 5 years. Another herd, an improved well system, possibly a small orchard on the sheltered eastern slope. "That is a good plan," she said, looking at the land around her. "Sound surprised?" "I am not surprised. I am recognizing a person who thinks about land the same way I do." He was quiet for a moment, walking beside her. Then he said, "What are you going to do after when you get the land back?" "Go back to Wellington," she said. "Fix it up, start the herd again." She paused. "It is harder with one person than with two." "It is," he agreed, "but not impossible." "No," she said. "Nothing is impossible if you are willing to do the work." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him, looking out at the line of new fence posts marching away into the evening distance. When she turned to look at him, he was looking at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen on anyone's face for so long that it took her a moment to understand what it was. "I like you, Alma Reed," he said simply. "I realize that is possibly an inconvenient thing to say." She looked at him steadily. "Why inconvenient?" "Because you have a situation to resolve and a life waiting for you somewhere else, and I don't imagine you came to Caldwell looking for complications." "I came here looking for Ellis Donahue," she agreed. "That is true." "And yet," he said, with a slight tentative quality she had not heard from him before, "here we are." She felt the warmth she had been managing for 2 weeks move through her thoroughly, and she let it, standing in the evening light of the Sheridan Ranch with the grass smelling of summer and the sky going pink along the west edge. "Here we are," she said softly. He did not kiss her. He was a careful man. She had understood that about him from the beginning, careful in the way that people are careful when they have learned that rushing important things makes them go wrong. He simply held her gaze with his honest, dark eyes for a moment, and then they turned back toward the house together, walking close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched. She did not sleep at all that night, and it had nothing to do with dread. The circuit judge, Ellison, arrived in Caldwell on a Wednesday morning with little ceremony, a compact, white-haired man in his 60s who came down from the stage with a leather case and the expression of someone who had heard every variety of human complaint and was prepared to hear more. He set up his court in the largest room of the Caldwell Town Hall, which doubled as a meeting place for whatever civic business required gathering. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, which gave Waverly and Alma 5 more days to prepare, and they used them carefully. Waverly had sent a telegram to the Wellington County Recorder's office and received a written response confirming that the original land deed was registered in the names of Alma Reed and Thomas Reed, with no transfer of interest on record. This was significant. Donahue claimed Tommy had signed over his interest voluntarily before his death, but if the Wellington County Registry showed no such transfer, it meant either the paperwork had never been filed or it did not exist. Donahue hired a lawyer of his own, a man named Graves who came up from Wichita on the Friday stage, well-dressed and confident in the way of men, accustomed to winning cases for clients with money. Graves was good. Alma could see that from watching him in the 2 brief encounters before the hearing, the way he moved through the town hall, the way he spoke to Judge Ellison during the brief procedural meeting Waverly also attended. Nathan came to Caldwell on the Sunday before the hearing and found her in the hotel lobby reviewing her notes. He sat across from her and waited until she had finished the page she was on before he said anything. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Prepared," she said. "Nervous." "Mostly prepared. You have the truth on your side," he said. "That matters to Judge Ellison." "It does not always matter," she said honestly. "No," he agreed. "But here with this man I believe it does." She looked at him across the table at the steady certainty he seemed to carry without effort, like something simply true about the structure of him. "I would not have gotten this far without you," she said. "You would have," he said. "It might have taken longer, but you would have found a way. You're that kind of person." "What kind of person is that?" "The kind that does not stop," he said. "That finds the next thing when the current thing fails. That keeps going." He paused. "It's admirable, Alma, and it must also be exhausting." She felt the truth of that land somewhere behind her sternum, and for a moment her composure became a thinner thing than she usually allowed. "It is," she said. "It is very exhausting." He reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his, a steady, warm pressure, and then withdrew. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It had the effect of a long night's sleep. "Tomorrow you get your land back," he said, "and then we'll talk about everything else." She looked at him. "Everything else." "Everything else," he said, and his eyes held the same honest, direct quality they always held, but with something in them now that she recognized because she felt it herself. She nodded. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." The hearing on Monday morning was attended by nearly every person in Caldwell who could find a reason to be present, which was most of them. The town hall was hot and smelled of sawdust and too many bodies, and the wooden chairs scraped constantly as people shifted and whispered. Judge Ellison sat at the front table with the contained authority of someone who did not need to perform his own importance. He called the room to order with a single knock of his gavel, and it immediately fell quiet in the specific way that rooms fall quiet for people who have genuine authority. Graves argued for Donahue first. He was smooth and detailed, presenting the partnership agreement, and the document he claimed was Tommy Reed's voluntary transfer of interest, which he said Tommy had signed in the presence of Donahue and a witness named James Crowder, a man Alma did not know, who was present in the room and who was apparently willing to testify to that fact. Alma listened with her face composed and still, taking notes on a small pad in the careful handwriting she had developed over years of keeping ranch accounts. Then Peter Waverly rose, and he was a different kind of lawyer than Graves, less smooth and more precise, like a good tool being used correctly. He presented the Wellington County Registry. He presented the written confirmation from the county recorder. He established the clear documentary record that the land had been registered in the names of Alma Reed and Thomas Reed with no transfer on record. Then he addressed the witness, James Crowder, and here was where it became interesting. Waverly had done something Alma had not known about until that morning. He had sent a telegram to a man in Wellington who had known Tommy Reed, a neighboring rancher named Silas Hart, asking Hart whether Tommy had ever mentioned someone named James Crowder. Silas Hart had wired back that morning, and Waverly presented the telegram, which stated that James Crowder had, in fact, been employed by Donahue's associate companies in the year before Tommy's death, and that Tommy Reed had specifically told Silas Hart he did not trust men associated with Donahue. The testimony of a man willing to commit perjury for an employer begins to look different when that relationship is established in front of an honest judge. Ellison asked Crowder directly whether he had ever been employed in any capacity by Ellis Donahue or any company associated with him, and Crowder, who had apparently not been prepared for this specific question, hesitated long enough to be telling. Graves objected. Ellison overruled him. Crowder admitted to having done occasional work for Donahue's cattle operation the previous year. From that point, the document that purported to be Tommy's signature became a thing that required examination rather than a thing that could be simply presented. Ellison ordered it held pending the assessment of a handwriting expert, which would require the case to be continued for a period, but he also issued an immediate order preventing Donahue from selling, transferring, or encumbering any of the assets in question pending the outcome. It was not a full victory, but it was the critical one. Donahue's face when Ellison issued the preservation order was the face of a man who had expected a wall and found a door, and who understood suddenly that the room on the other side of the door was not what he had assumed. As people filed out of the town hall afterward, Alma stood in the bright morning sunshine and allowed herself to breathe fully for what felt like the first time in months. Nathan appeared beside her. He had been in the room, seated in the back, and she had known he was there the whole time without looking. "Well done," he said quietly. "Waverly," she said, "and you for sending me to him. How long do you need to wait for the handwriting assessment?" Waverly says perhaps 3 weeks. The expert is in Wichita. Nathan nodded. He looked at her with that careful, considering expression. "Then you'll be here another 3 weeks. It appears so," she said. The light was very clear and bright, and the street was full of the sounds of a town going about its normal business. He was standing close to her, and she could feel the warmth of him in the morning air. "I'm glad," he said simply. She looked at him, and some last remaining piece of the carefully constructed armor she had been wearing for 6 months shifted and became something different, something lighter, something she did not quite have a name for yet. "So am I," she said, and she meant it. The weeks that followed had a quality she had not expected, a quality of ordinariness that turned out to be extraordinary. She had spent so long in motion, so long driven by the cold engine of her grudge, that the experience of simply being in a place, with work to do and people to talk to and an evening to look forward to, felt almost foreign. But she settled into it the way a person settles into a long chair after a long journey, with a gratitude so deep it was almost physical. She continued to help Clara Minton at the hotel, and Clara, who was perceptive in the way of women who had watched a great many people pass through, began to ask after Nathan with a particular casual interest that fooled neither of them. "He's a good man," Clara said one morning, pressing sheets. "Lonely, though. He doesn't talk about it, but you can see it." "Most people who are lonely do not talk about it," Alma said. "You know about that," Clara said, not unkindly. She rode out to the Sheridan ranch 3 more times in those weeks, twice in the buckboard with Nathan and once alone on the roan, who was fully recovered and moved with a willing, energetic stride that felt like an apology for the trouble she had been at the start. On that solitary visit, she arrived to find Nathan working in one of the corrals with a young horse, a dark bay that was not yet convinced that people could be trusted. She leaned on the fence rail and watched him for nearly an hour. He worked with patience and consistency, never forcing, never frightening, simply being present and predictable, and allowing the animal time to understand that presence and predictability were not threats. By the end of the hour, the bay was following him at a loose trot with the tentative, hoping quality of an animal beginning to believe in something. When he came out of the corral, he was dusty and relaxed in the specific way of satisfying physical work. "You are very good with horses," she said. "They're honest," he said, accepting the water canteen she handed him. "They tell you exactly what they think. I appreciate that in a creature." She looked at him with a directness she no longer tried to moderate. "I appreciate it too," she said. He looked back at her for a moment, and then he smiled, the full, unguarded smile she had been collecting like something precious, and said, "Come see the orchard site. I want your opinion." They walked together to the sheltered eastern slope, where he had staked out the area he intended for planting in the spring. It was a good spot, protected from the prevailing winds, with a gentle south-facing aspect and a small depression in the land that suggested it held moisture better than the surrounding ground. "What kind of trees?" she asked. "Apple mainly, maybe some plum." "Apple varieties that do well in Kansas." "My father had a small orchard," she said. 6 apple trees. I thought they were magnificent when I was a child." She crouched to pick up a handful of soil, feeling its texture and weight. "This is good. You could do well here." "I plan to," he said. He was watching her examine the soil with an expression she caught when she looked up, a kind of quiet, wondering attention. When she met his eyes, he did not look away. She stood and let the soil fall from her fingers. They were standing perhaps 2 feet apart, the warm afternoon around them, the grass moving in a light wind. "Alma," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to kiss you," he said, with that same direct, unhurried quality he brought to everything. "If you are willing." She felt the warmth she had stopped trying to push away move through her fully and completely. "I am willing," she said. He kissed her in the way she might have predicted if she had thought about it, which was carefully and honestly, and with a kind of thorough attention that made everything else in the world temporarily irrelevant. She kissed him back with everything she had been holding since the first morning she had looked over her shoulder in the livery and found an honest face paying attention to her horse. When they separated, the light had not changed. The grass was still moving in the same light wind. Everything was exactly the same and entirely different. "I thought about doing that approximately 40 times since the morning you rode into that livery," he said. "Only 40, she said. He laughed. It was a wonderful laugh, full and real and slightly surprised, as if he had not expected to be made to laugh, and she filed it away next to the smile. They walked back to the house in the evening light with their hands occasionally finding each other, and holding briefly, and then releasing. And she thought that this was the strangest and most welcome thing she had felt in years. The handwriting expert arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday in late August. A precise, bespectacled man named Dr. Aldous Fenwick from Wichita, who carried his expertise with him like a personal weather system. He examined the document purporting to be Tommy Reed's signature for 2 full days in the Caldwell Town Hall, comparing it against authenticated samples of Tommy's handwriting that Alma provided from letters Tommy had written over the previous 5 years. Letters she had carried with her from Wellington, because she carried everything of Tommy's that she could. On Thursday morning, Waverly brought her the report. "Forged," he said simply, and the word was so clean and direct that she felt it land with the satisfying precision of something fitting exactly where it was meant to go. Fenwick had found 17 specific inconsistencies between the document's signature and Tommy's authenticated hand. His report was 7 pages and would, Waverly said, be absolutely decisive before Judge Ellison. The second hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Donahue's lawyer Graves met with Waverly on Friday afternoon, and on Saturday morning, Waverly came to tell her that Donahue had offered to settle. He would sign over the Wellington land deed, restore the cattle assets or their cash value, and return the bank account funds, in exchange for her agreement not to pursue criminal fraud charges against him. She sat in the hotel lobby with this information for a long time. What she wanted was for Donahue to face a court and be publicly called what he was. What she also needed was her land back. Her cattle, Tommy's investment, returned and honored, and she had learned from long experience that wanting and needing were not always the same thing, and that confusing them was how people made decisions they regretted. She went to find Nathan. He was at the feed store, as his foreman had told her he would be, going over supply orders with a quiet focus that she now recognized as one of his standard working states. He looked up when she came in and read her face immediately. "News," he said. "Donahue wants to settle." She told him the terms. He listened without interrupting, then leaned against the counter and was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" he asked. "Not what's practical. What do you want?" She appreciated the question in its exact form. "I want him to answer for it in court," she said. "I want it on record publicly what he did, because if he is not held accountable, he will do it to someone else." "That's true," Nathan said. "But if I refuse the settlement and pursue the criminal charges, it takes longer and is less certain, and I have learned that certainty has value." She looked at him steadily. "What would you do?" He thought about it properly, not reflexively. "I think I would take the settlement, because getting your land back is the necessary thing, and justice in a courthouse is not always what it appears. But I think you should tell Waverly to make Donahue aware formally that you have copies of Fenwick's report and the full file, and that you intend to share them with the county prosecutor for his consideration, regardless of the settlement. You cannot control what the prosecutor does with them, but you can make sure the information exists in official hands." It was exactly the right answer. She felt the clean satisfaction of being understood by someone who was genuinely trying to understand. "Yes," she said, "that is what I'll do." The settlement was signed on Monday morning before Judge Ellison, who reviewed the terms and documented them formally. Donahue signed back the deed with the practiced calm of a man who had calculated that cutting losses was more valuable than protracted legal loss, and who appeared to understand that he was getting out of this situation more cleanly than he deserved. Alma stood in the town hall doorway afterward with the signed deed in her hand and looked at the familiar document with Tommy's name and her own on it. The ink slightly faded now after months of travel, the paper worn soft at the corners, but real. Real and hers. She thought about Tommy, about his too large laugh and his plans for the windmill, and the 6 weeks they had spent crammed into a corner of a snow-damaged house, turning disaster into story. She cried, properly and fully, for the first time since he had died. She was standing in the doorway alone when it happened, and she let it happen without apology. The grief moved through her like a long-held breath finally released, and the stone in her chest did not disappear but changed again, becoming something she could carry rather than something that only held her down. When she had finished, she wiped her face and went to find Nathan because she wanted to tell him first. He was waiting outside, leaning against a post with his hat in his hand, and when he saw her face, he straightened and moved toward her without hesitation. "Got it," he said. "Got it," she said. He took both her hands in his, and she felt the steadiness of him, the warmth of him, all the way through. She also went to the county prosecutor that afternoon, as Nathan had suggested, and delivered a full copy of Fenwick's report and the case file, and told the prosecutor, a thoughtful man named Patterson who listened without dismissing her, that she left it in his hands to determine whether formal charges were warranted. Patterson told her he would review it. Whether he would act on it she could not know, but she had done what she could. The information existed. It was in official hands. Whatever came of it was now part of the world in a way it had not been before. She was done. She rode out to the Sheridan ranch that evening without the deed, because she had sent it to Waverly for secure keeping until she could arrange its permanent recording. She arrived as the sun was going down, the sky enormous and layered with color in the specific way of Kansas summers, and Nathan was sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee, apparently having expected her, because Margaret appeared in the doorway with a second cup almost immediately. She sat beside him on the steps and they watched the sky change color over the flat expanse of the land, and it was a long time before either of them spoke. "What happens now?" he said finally. She had been thinking about this for the past 2 days with the careful, architectural quality she usually brought to problems, but this was not a problem. This was a question she knew the answer to and was still learning how to say. "I need to go back to Wellington," she said. "The land has been sitting. I need to assess what Donahue's people did to it, if anything, and start rebuilding." She paused. "I need to start the herd again. It will take time." "It will," he agreed. She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon with that honest, settled expression. In the fading light, the weathering of his face softened, and she could see the 20-year-old he had been, alone on a struggling ranch, terrified and refusing to fail. "I do not want to leave," she said. The words came out steadier than she expected, given how much they meant. He turned to look at her. "I mean," she continued, "I have thought about this carefully, and I know that the Wellington land is mine and that Tommy worked for it and that I have an obligation to it. But I have also thought about the fact that every day for the past 6 weeks has been better than the one before it because of you. And I am not generally someone who ignores information when it is this clear." Nathan was very still. "I am not asking you for anything," she said. "I am just telling you what is true, because you are a person who values honesty, and so am I, and I think we should not leave honesty out of the important things." He set down his coffee cup with great deliberateness, and then he turned fully toward her on the step, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, more open even than when he had laughed that afternoon on the eastern slope. "I don't want you to go either," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say that without being the kind of man who asks a woman to give up her own life for his convenience. Returning what was stolen to me and then rebuilding it is not a convenience or an inconvenience," she said. "It is my life, but lives can be reconsidered." "Can they?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "The Wellington land is 240 acres, she said. "The Sheridan Ranch is 4 sections, which is more than 1,000. I have looked at the county records because I look at county records. It is simply what I do." She took a breath. "I am not suggesting I would abandon the Wellington land. I am suggesting that 240 acres could be managed by one capable hired hand, and that the person who manages it could reasonably live elsewhere while maintaining ownership." He looked at her for a long time. The sky had gone from orange to deep rose above them. "Are you asking me something?" he said, with the slight, tentative quality she had heard from him once before, on the evening he had told her he liked her. "I am not asking you anything," she said. "I am telling you what is possible, and I am asking you to tell me whether you want to explore it." He reached out and took her hand the way he had briefly taken it in the hotel lobby before the hearing, but this time he did not withdraw. "Yes," he said, "I want to explore it." She felt something that was the opposite of the stone in her chest, something open and wide and a little terrifying in the way that good things were terrifying. "Good," she said. "Then we will." Margaret's supper that night was not as elaborate as the one from the first visit, but it was warm and filling. And Danny, the young cowhand, made Alma laugh 3 times with stories about the bay horse Nathan had been training. And Pete, the older hand, said exactly 4 words all evening, and somehow those 4 words were the most useful ones spoken. And Nathan's hand found hers under the table at one point and stayed there for a good long while. It was, she thought, exactly what it was supposed to be. She spent 2 more weeks in Caldwell, tying up the practical matters. She arranged with Peter Waverly to hold the Wellington deed and correspond with the county recorder. She arranged with a man in Wellington she had trusted in the past, a former neighbor named Amos Greer, to look after the land temporarily for a fair wage while she determined the long-term plan. She arranged the transfer of the cattle assets from Donahue's operation back into her legal possession, which took 3 days of paperwork, and the patient, detailed assistance of both Waverly and Nathan's more experienced contacts in the county administration. She also went to see Ellis Donahue once more, which no one advised her to do and which she did not ask permission for. She went in the morning before he had left his hotel, and she found him in the lobby with his bags packed, clearly preparing to leave Caldwell. He looked at her with the flat, calculating expression she had come to expect from him. "I am not here to threaten you or to argue with you," she said. "I am here to tell you something, which is that my brother Thomas Reed was a good man who trusted people, and you used that against him, and whatever the law does or does not do to you for it, I want you to know that I know what you are." She paused. "That is all." She walked out without waiting for him to respond. She did not need him to respond. The words had been for herself more than for him, and having said them she felt the last piece of the cold architecture of her grudge simply dissolve, like ice when you bring it into a warm room. It had done its job. It had carried her here. She did not need it anymore. Donahue left Caldwell that same day on the noon stage. She heard later, through Clara Minton's reliable information network, that Patterson, the prosecutor, had indeed moved forward with an inquiry based on the file she had submitted, and that Donahue had been contacted in connection with it. She did not follow up on the outcome. She had done her part. The rest was not in her hands. Nathan proposed to her on a Thursday morning in September, in the most Nathan Sheridan manner possible, which was to say directly and without excessive ceremony. They were checking the roans recovered hoofed together in the livery, because the horse was nearly fully sound, and they had been discussing the ride back to Wellington that Alma needed to take to formally review the property, when he straightened up from examining the hoof and said, in the same tone he used for most things, "I would like us to get married." She looked at him over the back of the roan. "I would like that too," she said. When he asked, "That is an excellent question," she said. "Practically speaking, I need to go to Wellington first. I need to see the land with my own eyes and make arrangements for Amos Greer to manage it through the winter. That is perhaps a 2-week trip." "I'll come with you," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You have a ranch to run. Danny and Pete can manage for 2 weeks," he said. "They've done it before." He paused. "I'd like to see the land you're talking about." She understood then what he was saying, that he wanted to understand what she had built and what she had lost and what she was now recovering, so that he could understand her more fully. It was the same impulse that had made him lead her to the county registry on the second day, the desire to help by understanding first. "All right," she said. "Then we go to Wellington, and when we come back we get married." "That is a good plan," he said. They rode to Wellington together in the second week of September, a journey of 2 days south and slightly west, through the golden autumn grass of the Kansas plain. She rode the roan, who moved freely and well, and Nathan rode his own horse, a large-framed sorrel gelding named Charlie, who was reliable and calm and therefore, she thought, very much like his owner. The Wellington land looked worse than she had feared and better than she had prepared herself for. Donahue's people had run cattle on it for several months, overgrazing the south section and leaving one of the fences damaged. But the structure of the land was unchanged. The well was intact, the small house was standing, and the quality of the soil, which she had always known was good, was evident even after a summer of misuse. Nathan walked it all with her, asking careful questions and listening to her answers, and occasionally making observations that reflected a knowledge of land management she respected deeply. "Good bones," he said at one point, which was exactly what she had been thinking. Amos Greer, who came out to meet them on the second day, was a weathered man of 50-something with a beard and a handshake like a vice and a direct, decent quality that she had always trusted. He and Nathan took to each other quickly, with the ease of two people who understood land and animals and practical work, and the arrangements she needed to make were settled in a single long afternoon conversation over coffee at Amos's kitchen table. On the last evening before they returned to Caldwell, she and Nathan sat on the small porch of the Wellington house, looking out over the land in the dusk. The grass was beginning to go to autumn gold, the sky enormous overhead, and somewhere in the south pasture a meadowlark was still singing, improbably persistent for September. She thought about Tommy with a love that did not hurt the way it used to. He was here in this land. He had worked it with her, put his hands into this same soil, looked at this same sky. She would not leave that behind by building something new. She would carry it forward. "He would have liked you," she said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I'd have liked him," he said. "From everything you've told me. He would have said you were exactly right for me," she said. "And then he would have made some joke at your expense to see how you took it." "I take jokes well," Nathan said. "I know," she said. "That's one of the things I like best about you." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him in the cooling evening air, and the meadowlark sang on. They rode back to Caldwell on a crisp October morning, and they were married 3 weeks later in the Caldwell Presbyterian Church, which was a simple white building that smelled of wood and candle wax, and was presided over by a minister named Reverend Cole, who was brief and kind, and seemed genuinely pleased to be performing the ceremony. Clara Minton attended and cried from the third row. Margaret from the ranch attended and did not cry but smiled so continuously that her face seemed to have forgotten any other expression. Danny, the cowhand, attended and made a speech afterward at the small gathering Margaret had organized at the ranch that was enthusiastic and somewhat rambling and very heartfelt. Pete, the older hand, attended, said nothing, and shook Nathan's hand with a visible emotion that was more eloquent than anything Danny had said. Peter Waverly attended and told Alma she had been his most interesting client in 15 years, which she took as the high compliment it was intended to be. Sheriff Harlan stopped by the gathering briefly, somewhat awkwardly, and told her that he had heard from Patterson about the inquiry into Donahue and that he was sorry for how things had begun between them in his office. She accepted the apology honestly because he appeared to mean it. She wore a dress Clara Minton had helped her find at the dry goods store, a deep blue that Clara said matched her eyes and that she found she did not mind wearing. Nathan wore his best coat and a clean white shirt, and looked at her when she came down the aisle of the church with an expression that she wanted to remember for the rest of her life. She told him that later in the evening, after everyone had gone home and they were alone in the ranch house for the first time as husband and wife, the October wind moving around the outside of the building and the lamp burning low on the table. "I want to remember the way you looked at me," she said. "Which time?" he said. "In the church," she said. He looked at her now with the same expression. "You can remember it as often as you like," he said, "because it is not going to change." She believed him, because Nathan Sheridan was a man whose word meant what it said, and she had been paying attention since the morning in the livery, and she had never yet found a discrepancy between what he said and what he was. That winter at the Sheridan Ranch was the first winter in 8 years that she did not face alone, and the difference was something she had not let herself fully imagine until she was living it. It was not that difficulty disappeared. There were hard days, a week in December when the temperature dropped so severely that 3 calves were lost, a January storm that required all hands to work through the night repairing damage to the north bunkhouse, a February stretch when the well mechanism froze and they had to haul water by hand for 11 days. But the difficulty was different when it was shared. She had understood this abstractly from the years with Tommy, but the quality of partnership between two adults who had both chosen the specific challenge of this life together had a particular strength to it that she had not known to want until she had it. She discovered that she was expecting a child in early March, when the Kansas spring was beginning to pull the color back into the world. She told Nathan on an evening when they had both come in from outdoor work, muddy and tired in the satisfying way, and she simply said it directly, as she said most important things. He was quiet for a long moment that she watched carefully. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her with a completeness of feeling that communicated more than any words he could have assembled. "Are you happy?" she asked against his shoulder. "Yes," he said simply. "Are you?" She thought about the answer. The land in Wellington, managed well by Amos Greer, improving already with proper care. The Sheridan Ranch around her, solid and known and growing. Nathan beside her, honest and steady and fully himself. The future, which had once seemed like a territory she was fighting through, now felt like a place she was actually traveling toward. "Yes," she said. "Very much yes." The summer of 1880 brought a heat that pressed down on the Kansas plain like a physical weight, but also brought steady, sufficient rains in June that made the grass rich and deep, and turned the Sheridan South pasture into something that looked like a painting. The cattle were doing well. Nathan had purchased 12 additional head in the spring good shorthorn stock, and the herd was building steadily. The news from Wellington, which Amos Greer sent by letter every few weeks, was positive. The overgrazing damage from Donahue's misuse was reversing. The fence Nathan had helped plan was repaired and holding. The south section was recovering. She had ridden down to Wellington once in April to see it herself, making the trip in 3 days and returning in 3, and what she had seen had given her something she had not expected: a decision. She had stood in the Wellington property and looked at the land that she and Tommy had built together, and she had felt Tommy's presence there fully and peacefully, and she had known that the land would always be part of her, that she would hold it in her legal name and in her heart, but that her life was in Caldwell now, at the Sheridan Ranch. The Wellington land, managed well, was Tommy's legacy continuing in the world. That was enough. That was the right thing. She told Nathan when she returned. "I'm going to keep the Wellington land," she said, "for Tommy, for what he built there, and someday, if we have children who want to work it, it will be there for them." Nathan nodded. "That's a good decision," he said. "I think so," she said. Their son was born in September of 1880, a large, healthy, indignant boy who announced his arrival at the Sheridan Ranch with a vigor that impressed even Margaret, who had attended at least 24 ranch births in her long career. The doctor came from town and found relatively little to do, because the birth was proceeding perfectly well with or without him. They named him Thomas, which was Alma's choice, and Nathan's immediate, unhesitating agreement. Thomas Sheridan was from his first days a person of strong opinions, a talent for communication, and an ability to make himself the center of any room without apparent effort, all of which made Alma think of Tommy with a love so full it was practically structural. Nathan held his son on the evening of his birth with the same careful, honest attention he brought to everything, and she watched him discover what she had watched him discover with the frightened bay horse, that patience and consistency and presence were the things that mattered, and that he had an abundance of all of them. "Hello, Thomas," he said quietly, to the small, reddening face looking up at him. "I'm your father. We're going to have a very good time." Thomas appeared to consider this and then closed his eyes, which Nathan took as agreement. The seasons turned, and the Sheridan Ranch grew and changed, and Alma grew and changed with it, not into something she had not been, but into something she had always been, with more room around it now, more space to expand. She kept her rifle. She had not given it up, and Nathan had never suggested she should, because he understood her better than almost anyone she had ever known, and he understood that the rifle was not aggression or danger but history, the years she had spent being capable and alone, and that capability and history deserved their dignity. The rifle hung on the wall of the ranch house office above the desk where she kept the accounts, which she managed with a precision that had improved the ranch's record-keeping considerably from the somewhat chaotic system Nathan had maintained before. He told her once, during their second winter, that the ranch was better in every way since she had arrived. "The accounts alone," he said, with a gravity that made her laugh. "The accounts were a disaster," she agreed. "An absolute disaster," he confirmed. 3 years of records that essentially said, and I summarize, money came and money went, the end. "I found 3 ledger errors that had been costing you $400 a year," she said. "You did," he said. "I married the best financial mind in Caldwell County and didn't even know I was doing it." "You married a woman with a grudge and a half-lame horse," she said. "Best decision I ever made," he said, and she heard the absolute truth of it and felt it land exactly where he intended. The county prosecutor in Caldwell did eventually pursue the fraud case against Donahue, as she learned from Peter Waverly in the spring following her marriage. Donahue was found and charged in Sedgwick County, where he had been attempting to establish a new operation, and was convicted of fraud and forgery in a Wichita court in 1881. Waverly sent her the newspaper report of the conviction, and she read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a quiet, settled satisfaction that had nothing of anger in it. Justice, when it came, had a different quality than revenge. It was simpler and cleaner, and she was glad she had trusted Waverly and Patterson to pursue it through proper channels while she got on with her life. She pinned the newspaper clipping to the letter she was writing to Amos Greer about the Wellington property that afternoon, with a note that said simply, "Tommy's story ended well. She thought he would understand." The years settled around the Sheridan ranch with the accumulating weight of time well used. They worked together in the way of people who genuinely respect each other's competence, which meant that they disagreed about things regularly, and resolved those disagreements with the slightly contentious, slightly amused efficiency of two people who know that the other person is quite possibly right. She learned things from Nathan that she had not known, the specific, patient approach to horse training that turned difficult animals into reliable ones, the management of a larger herd than she had run before, the politics of water rights in a growing county. He learned things from her, the account-keeping, the management of supply costs, the way of dealing with difficult people in official positions that she had developed through years of necessity. In the spring of 1882, Thomas Sheridan, who was a year and a half old and already in possession of a personality that suggested he intended to negotiate the terms of all future arrangements, began showing a determined fascination with the horses, which required new safety measures in the lower corral and a policy of constant supervision during morning rounds, which Alma enforced with a combination of maternal firmness and the particular calm that she had developed through everything she had been through. "He is going to be excellent with horses," Nathan said one evening, watching Thomas sit very seriously beside the roan in the main corral, patting her foreleg with both hands. The roan, long since fully sound and apparently aware of her special relationship with this family, stood entirely still for it. "He is going to be good at everything he decides to be good at," Alma said. "He has that quality." "He gets it from you," Nathan said. "And from you," she said. He looked at her, she looked at him. "Half and half," he said. "More than sufficient halves," she agreed. By the summer of 1882, the Wellington land was producing steady revenue under Amos Greer's capable management, enough to be self-sustaining and to contribute a modest but meaningful amount to the family's overall financial position. Alma had, in the years since retrieving it, made two careful improvements to the property. The windmill Tommy had planned and never built, which now stood over the south pasture well, and the repair and expansion of the small house, which made it comfortable enough for Amos and his wife to live in rent-free in exchange for the management work. She went to Wellington once a year, sometimes with Nathan, sometimes with Thomas on her back in a carrier Margaret had made. Each visit confirmed the same thing. The land was alive and being cared for, and Tommy's name was on the deed, and both of those things were right. In the autumn of 1883, their daughter arrived, small and dark-eyed and apparently possessed of an opinion about every aspect of her circumstances from the first moments. They named her Clara, for Clara Minton, who had been the first person in Caldwell to be kind to Alma without reservation or condition. Clara Minton, hearing the news, produced a letter that was 3 pages of sentiment and contained more exclamation points than Alma had believed an adult woman capable of deploying, and which she read to Nathan that evening with great feeling and the occasional pause to compose herself. With Thomas and Clara in the ranch house, and Margaret somewhere in every room being useful and saying fond things, and the 2 cowhands Danny and Pete carrying on their separate and complementary approaches to the world outside, the Sheridan Ranch had the quality of a place fully inhabited, fully alive, full of the sound and weight of a life that had been built deliberately and with care. Nathan found her one evening in the office, the lamp burning late, Thomas asleep in the next room and Clara asleep in the cradle that had been Nathan's when he was an infant, and which Margaret had kept in a storage room for reasons Margaret described as simply that good things should be kept. She was working on the ledgers, and he brought her a cup of coffee and sat down in the other chair and watched her work for a while in the comfortable silence that was one of the languages between them. "I was thinking today," he said, "about the morning you rode into the livery." She looked up. "What about it?" "You had that look," he said. "That look you get when you are absolutely certain of what you are doing and you are moving forward regardless of what the world thinks about it." "I still have that look," she said. "You do," he agreed. "I find it consistently impressive." He paused. "I also thought about how the roan was limping, and you had that bruise on your jaw, and you were exhausted down to your bones, but you took care of the horse before you took care of yourself." "She needed water," Alma said. "You always take care of what needs taking care of," he said. "In the right order, in the right way. I've never known anyone who does that as consistently as you." She looked at him across the desk, in the lamplit office of the ranch they had built together, with their children sleeping in the next rooms and the Kansas night vast and quiet outside the window. "I came into this town with a grudge and nothing else," she said, "and I found everything." "You brought everything with you," he said. "I just had the good sense to recognize it." She came around the desk and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her the same way he had on the Wellington porch in the September dusk 4 years ago, and she leaned against the warmth of him. "We have a very good life," she said. "We do," he said. "Tommy would approve," she said. "I have no doubt about that whatsoever," Nathan said. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars. The same stars that had watched her ride into Caldwell with nothing but a grudge and a half-lame horse, not knowing that the rancher who took her in would be the beginning of the best thing her life would ever hold. The grudge was gone now, dissolved the morning she had walked away from Ellis Donahue for the last time. What had replaced it was not the opposite of anger, not simple peace, but something richer and more complex. A life that was hers, fully and completely, built on the foundation of everything she and Tommy had worked for, and expanded by everything she and Nathan had built together. She was 28 years old, and she had a ranch and a husband and 2 children and land in Wellington that was growing better every season, and a rifle on the wall above the desk, and a roan horse in the corral who was aging gracefully, and a deep, thorough happiness that she intended to maintain by the same method she had maintained everything else in her life. By paying attention, by working hard, by being honest, and by never, under any circumstances, stopping. Thomas Sheridan called out from the next room in the particular tone that indicated a dream had disturbed him and required parental reassurance. Nathan was already moving before the second sound. She listened to him go in there, heard the low murmur of his voice, heard Thomas settle back into sleep in the way of a child who knew completely that the person who had come was trustworthy and that everything was, in fact, all right. She turned back to the ledgers, picked up her pen and smiled and continued her work. The stars over Kansas kept turning in their ancient circuits, indifferent to the small, bright thing that was one family in one ranch house on the great dark plain. But she was not indifferent to it, not for a single moment of what remained of her long and full and fortunate life. She had ridden into Caldwell with a grudge, and the grudge had done its job, and then it was done, and in its place, without her having planned for it or looked for it or believed in it coming, had grown something that the grudge never could have been. Something that held and lasted and deepened and lit the rooms of everything around it. Nathan came back from Thomas's room and stood in the doorway of the office, and she looked up at him, and he was smiling the full, unguarded smile she had been collecting since the beginning. And she thought, as she thought most evenings in one form or another, that she had come into this town looking for what had been taken from her. And she had found that, yes, and she had found Nathan Sheridan, which was something she had never thought to look for at all, and which turned out to be the most important thing of all. "All settled," he said. "Good," she said. He came back to sit beside her, and she leaned against his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a long time in the warm, lamplit room while the Kansas night turned slowly toward morning.